If you ever wonder how much confidence we put into brands that we choose, this should prove it.
This was originally intended to be a sponsored video, but SawStop has a strict company policy that prevents them from supporting demonstrations where someone intentionally touches the blade. I may have overlooked that part of the marketing guidelines. By the time we realised, the video was already filmed, edited, and my finger had already emotionally been through enough. So, we're releasing this video ourselves, at our own cost, and we hope to work with SawStop again in the future. Ideally after I've actually read the guidelines properly. Enjoy the video, stay safe, do not repeat what you just saw.
In this video, we're going to be unboxing and setting up the SawStop Professional Cabinet Saw, a saw that has finally made its way to the UK after many years of waiting. We've been wanting to upgrade our table saw for a very long time, and with its exceptional build quality, plus the finger-saving technology that I'll be testing later, this felt like the perfect choice.
SawStop machines work by sending a small electrical signal through the spinning blade, so that when skin, which conducts electricity much better than wood, touches the blade, it triggers a brake cartridge that fires into the wood, stopping it in a fraction of a second, and the force of the impact also drives the blade down beneath the table.
One of the most common criticisms of these systems is that if you use a table saw correctly, you shouldn't need this technology in the first place. And I do actually agree with that statement to some extent. The vast majority of table saw and machine accidents happen likely due to lack of training or just plain negligence. But dismissing this technology in its entirety is like saying you don't need seatbelts if you know how to drive correctly, because in either case, you can't account for freak events.
The first thing that stood out while unboxing this machine was the clear labelling on every component and every piece of hardware. Compared to most tool manufacturers, who usually just toss you a bag of bolts and a poorly translated manual, this felt like a real luxury. One of the things I've heard about these saws over the years is that their build quality is so good that the safety mechanism actually feels more like a bonus rather than the main feature. So having used a lot of expensive table saws over my woodworking career, as well as some fairly entry-level ones, I think this puts me in a unique position to evaluate exactly how this stacks up against everything else out there.
Just a little, remember, ring finger.
I feel like that would hurt more.
What would you rather lose, a tip of a finger or an entire section?
Yeah, but you know when you scrape the end of your finger, it really hurts, whereas that bit, it's not too bad.
Oh yeah, it might not be too bad when it doesn't work this one time in history and you remove a whole finger, as opposed to the tip.
Are we insured?
Not for negligence.
So it's worth saying in this video that we will be adding all of the accessories to this, but you don't need all of those for the saw to work. We're just doing it because we've got the space, and we'll put chapters below to reflect each of the accessories that we'll be adding. But given that we'll be adding a lot of weight to this thing, we're going to kick things off with this lovely looking mobile base. So this mobile base has a simple rise and fall, all done on this piston at the front here. That one rises it up. This little tread lever here will lower it down.
Now, I'll be the first to admit that when I started woodworking, I made a decision that I was never going to cut my fingers off. I'd always use tools properly, I'd always stay cautious, and I would keep a healthy amount of fear and respect around machinery to stop me from doing anything stupid.
But after more than a decade of woodworking, that early confidence, or naivety, has completely worn off. Here's why. I'm sure all of you who drive a vehicle can relate to this. You know when you're driving along and you suddenly come to and you realise you have no recollection of the miles you've just covered because you've just been daydreaming the entire time. The same thing happens when you're using machinery. When you get used to using certain machines or processes, your brain flicks to autopilot mode and you stop paying the same close attention you used to. There's also an old saying that most car accidents happen within a mile of your home, not just because you're on familiar roads, but because you're too familiar. You get overconfident and that's when you take risks. And it is exactly the same with woodworking machinery. I know all of the safe ways and the proper ways of doing things, but I also know a few quicker and easier methods to carry out the same things that come at the slight expense of risk.
Do you want a hand at all, or are you just gonna...
There you go. Get the Johnny off. Do the honours. Yeah, boy. I mean, that is just unreal. So smooth.
So the first impressions of the saw were incredibly positive. The tables were finished beautifully, the mechanisms very well thought out, and it was all really easy to put together.
I'm really liking the attention to detail with assembling this thing. I'm tightening these two at the moment. This one's easy enough to access, but this one here is a bit of a pig. But look, there's just a little through hole here. No other reason for it other than that. And it just means you can tighten that one up. I can't imagine how many iterations it took them designing this saw to get all of these details figured out. Because honestly, there's so many bits throughout where I'm just finding little, well thought out things like this, and it really goes a long way. All right, so there we go. That is the bulk of the saw put together. Next, I'm going to move on to the sliding table before I do the outfeed table, because we've got the folding outfeed with this, and there's a few different configurations for that that are decided by what you choose to do with the sliding table.
As I expected, this was also really easy to put together and basically required no tweaking whatsoever, other than getting the tables level with one another.
Now, when SawStop were conducting market research prior to launching in the UK, they actually came and visited the workshop to ask what I would be looking for in a table saw, as well as reconcile that with what they were planning on releasing. And I gave them my honest opinion, which is this. Most of the features in a table saw I'm actually pretty flexible on. I just want something that's powerful, 10-inch blade or so, is robust and is of course accurate. But historically, I've not been a massive fan of this type of sliding table, where you've got the blade here, the sliding table here, and you've got this kind of stationary bit of table in between them. I'm actually much more partial to panel saw style table saws, where the sliding table goes right up to the side of the blade and there's no kind of stationary table in between it. My reasoning for this is that when you're putting pressure on top of the wood, as you're pushing it through the blade, you're pressing down on the stationary table underneath, which creates friction and makes it harder to push through. Whereas panel saws carry it through effortlessly despite any pressure you're putting down from above, because the entire table is moving, not just the fence. And of course, this is what table saw sleds are designed to solve. In fact, what you're seeing here is a really low budget one I made for my old table saw a few months ago when I was making a bunch of picture frames. But there can be drawbacks to these sleds, such as limited cutting capacities, and sometimes it can be hard to properly guard the blade, but on the whole, they are a pretty good compromise. That said, however, the only time I've used a table saw with a sliding fence like this was during college, and it was fitted onto our backup table saw that was only really used when the main saw was in use. This backup saw worked okay, but it wasn't quite as well dialed in as our main saw. It didn't cut quite as cleanly, and the extraction was pretty bad on it too. Basically, what I'm acknowledging here is a slight bias I might have towards sliding tables like this, because the vast majority of people get on absolutely fine with them, and I'm open to the fact that when I use it a bit more and I get a bit more comfortable with it, maybe I will too. In fact, one thing I'll probably do in the future is actually remove just this entire left-hand extension table and bolt the sliding table directly to the main saw body, which is along this seam line here. That's going to reduce the amount of friction I get from the stationary table, but it will also require me to basically cut off this part of the fence rail along that join line there in order to get this sliding table close enough. And this isn't just me being a barbarian with our new table saw. This is actually an option that's listed in the SawStop manual, and it talks you through how to cut off that fence accurately and everything, but I can't be bothered to do it just yet. We'll do it in the future. Right, so that's the sliding crosscut done. Little bit of adjustment to do on it. It's pretty perfect out the box though. This floor isn't perfectly level, but all that adjustment is finicky stuff that I'm going to do once everything is together. So next I'm going to move on to the folding outfeed table here at the back of the saw.
This outfeed table is fairly straightforward in its construction. It's just a bunch of square sections bolted together in various ways, a couple of clamps that attach it to the back of the saw, and two pivotable legs underneath that let it fold away.
Right, so that's the outfeed table done. That was simultaneously the easiest and also the hardest part of the build so far, mostly because the author of this booklet clearly had a word count they needed to hit, and they just filled it with all sorts of needless detail when actually it's very easy to put together. So I think this could be simplified a fair bit, but anyway, we got it together. So next we're doing the final thing, which is the overhead guard.
I love these overhead guards, and I'm so glad I finally got one, because with my old table saw, most of the time I had to take the crown guard off, which is not something to brag about, but a lot of the time it just gets in the way, and it sometimes stops you from being able to carry out certain operations, like when you're cutting grooves, for example. But you shouldn't do it unless absolutely necessary and you know the risks involved. That's not the case with these overhead guards though. They're completely separate from the blade and riving knife assembly, which lets you float it above the blade, giving you better visibility to the cutting area and lets you cut grooves while having full guarding in place.
Just realised I've put this bit on wrong. That needs to be round the other way, which means this needs to then be... gotta take it apart and do it again. Bam! Ta-da! There we go. Forgot to film it, but that makes way more sense.
Now, when you power the machine, it has this interesting feature that uses two lights to indicate things like startup sequences, activation of the safety system, as well as various error codes. And there's also a small key that comes with the machine, which is used to temporarily turn off the safety system if you were to be working with conductive materials that may unintentionally set it off, such as wood that has a high moisture content and foil-backed materials.
Green, solid on, slow blink. Startup initializing. Oh, cool. Solid on, ready or running. Right.
Wow, that's done smooth.
Oh, there's a lovely bit of air coming from that.
That's so much worse.
Yeah.
Feeling sweaty.
So with all of this talk of safety and with the saw built and looking lovely, by the way, it was now time to put it to the test. What you're about to watch was me being the most scared I have been in a very, very long time, if not my entire life. I want to be very clear when I say this, that SawStop do not encourage people to do this. In fact, they don't even let their own demonstrators do this. And if you're thinking this is reckless, I understand why, I don't blame you for that, but here's the reason I wanted to do it. When I talk about tools on this channel, I'm asking you to trust my judgment, and that trust means something. We spend a great deal of effort here focusing on brands that we know we can put 100% trust on, and I can't tell you the amount of opportunities that we throw away, even though the pay can sometimes be very nice. It's not just about me using a product, it's about me putting my own hands and personal safety behind the words I say. This is me putting my own finger on the line to prove that, not just for dramatic effect or to show off, although there is a sprinkle of both of that in there. It's because if I'm going to stand here and tell you that this table saw can save your fingers, I need to know that for myself. Here's what happened.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, right, let's start it up. Okay. Holy f***ing shit.
Don't forget you've got to say something first, I don't know what it is.
Yeah. Thumb.
Thumb? Okay.
Or finger. Right. Just getting comfortable. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. If you ever wonder how much confidence we put into brands that we choose, this should prove it. Holy sh**.
Anything?
A scratch. Oh.
You nutter.
Yeah, it's taken, you do feel it. It's like a little tickle.
What, the stack there?
No, look, there. It's taken basically,
Like a paper cut.
yeah, it's taken like the top, that's basically, yeah, the top edge of a blade. Look at my hands f***ing shaking. Well, it works.
I think you might need to take a time out before you drive.
I'm still shaking, I've still got adrenaline. Oh, okay, thank that's done.
Jesus Christ, man.
Well, we got the shot. Now look, if you feed your finger into the machine at any sort of pace, of course you're going to get a slightly bigger scratch than what I did. In fact, it'll probably be no worse than what my cat did to me the other day. Little feisty bitch, I tell you, really hurt. But funnily enough, this was actually the first time we used the machine. It hadn't even cut a single piece of wood yet. So I can officially say that the first thing that saw cut was flesh. Since then, however, I've really been putting this thing through its paces. In fact, it was pretty much running non-stop last week, ripping timber down to width for some project packs that we've just restocked, including this massive section of 2-inch brown oak that it tore through like nothing. I've not fully hooked up the extraction to the crown guard yet, nor used the sliding table for any extended periods of time, but the first impressions of this saw and its core performance was everything I hoped for. Now look, there's a pretty common argument against SawStop and the safety mechanisms in general, saying that they will almost encourage people to take risks. And I certainly understand the logic behind that statement. In fact, I probably would have agreed with it at one point in the past, but having used this saw for an extended period of time now, I can say for certain that it just doesn't play out that way in real life. If you've spent years working around machinery, you're wired to keep your hands well away from the blade, or at least be very cautious when they are near it. That instinct doesn't just switch off when there's a safety feature. When I was putting my finger into the blade, I had full intention of doing it at a kind of working pace, but my brain just would not let me. There was still a very real part of me saying, absolutely not. And that's kind of proven by the reactions I got from people when I told them I was going to do this. If it were a woodworker I was speaking to, they would physically wince at the idea of me doing it. Whereas if I spoke to anyone outside of woodworking, who I guess weren't really conditioned and aware of the dangers and the damage that table saws can cause in an instant, they kind of just almost encouraged it. And I think what that proves is that people are obviously conditioned to different levels of risk. And realistically, any risky behavior they perform while using a SawStop machine with a safety feature, they probably would have done on an old table saw without the safety feature anyway. Basically, what I found is the existence of a safety feature doesn't create that behavior. In fact, if anything, it's probably made me more cautious because now I've got two things on my mind. Don't cut your finger and don't set off the safety mechanism and write off that perfectly good blade. For me, the real value of this system isn't in stopping deliberate risk-taking. It's there for the moments when your brain slips into autopilot, when you're tired or distracted, or thinking about what you're going to eat for dinner that night. It's protection for the split-second mistake that you didn't mean to do. And that's something that can happen to anyone. Now, the safety cartridge is a write-off once it fires and will need replacing, but that process is very quick and simple and can be done in a couple of minutes. SawStop also say that around half the time the blade itself can still be used afterwards. I'll take their word on that, but I don't know, if I ever set the brake cartridge off, I probably won't be reusing that blade again because I'd be worried, firstly, just about the cut quality, but also, you know, you never quite know if a tooth has been compromised in a way that you can't see. So I wouldn't do it, but SawStop say you can, 50% of the time at least. So do with that information what you will. But as for the machine overall, it really is brilliant, and I completely understand why SawStop do not support demonstrations like this. In fact, their founder has already proved the point, so nobody else has to. So if you see them at a show or event, don't bother asking the reps to put their own finger in the blade, because they're not allowed to, and it's probably the 50th time someone has tried that line on them that day. The results of this technology really does speak for itself, and there is countless stories out there of people saving all 10 digits thanks to it. And I'm also really happy to say that the overall build quality of the saw, as I expected at the start, almost makes the safety mechanism feel like a bonus. In some ways you forget it's there, in other ways you're really worried about setting it off. Overall, it is just a brilliant saw, and I really look forward to actually using it in proper projects going forward. And I'll just wrap this up by saying sorry to SawStop. If you could just highlight the important bits in red crayon, I can usually spot that. But I hope to work with you in the future, and thank you to everyone for watching.